Here is a question that stops most serious motorsport historians cold. Which car won the World Rally Championship 3 consecutive times? Which car won the Monte Carlo Rally 5 times between 1973 and 1979? Which car was the first ever purpose-built rally racing machine, designed from scratch for competition rather than converted from an existing road car? And which car was killed by its own manufacturer while it was still the fastest thing in its class, not because it was obsolete, but because of a corporate decision made in a boardroom in Turin that had nothing whatsoever to do with the car's performance on a special stage? The answer to all 4 questions is the Lancia Stratos. Approximately 492 were built, barely between 1973 and 1978. The number was dictated not by demand or commercial calculation, but by the FIA's homologation requirement for Group 4 competition. You needed 500 road-going examples registered before your race car could compete in the World Rally Championship. Lancia did not quite reach 500. The FIA counted what was in front of them on the 1st of October 1974, found the number sufficient, and issued the homologation certificate. The Stratos went on to win 18 outright World Rally Championship victories. It secured the 1974, 1975, and 1976 Constructors' Championships. It then won the Monte Carlo Rally outright in 1979, 3 years after Lancia had officially withdrawn factory support. With private teams running cars, the manufacturer no longer officially backed. The car was genuinely untameable. Its chassis engineer designed it around the physical dimensions of one specific driver. Its cockpit was so small that the door pockets were used not for maps or gloves, but for the helmets the driver and co-driver were about to put on. Its wraparound windscreen was a geometrically constant radius to minimize optical distortion at speed. It had almost no rear visibility whatsoever. And Lancia killed it to sell more Fiat 131 Abarths. That is the story we are telling today. Section 1. Italy in 1970 and the unlikely birth of a legend. The Lancia Stratos did not begin in an engineering office. It began at an auto show. Specifically, it began at the Turin Motor Show in November 1970 on the Bertone stand, where a design study of almost hallucinatory audacity was unveiled to a crowd that had no idea whether they were looking at a car, a sculpture, or a piece of space-age provocation. The car was called the Strato Zero, the name a reference to the stratosphere, which was very much the cultural reference point of the moment in the year after the Apollo moon landing. It was designed by Marcello Gandini, the head designer at Bertone, who was simultaneously at work on the Lamborghini Countach and had already produced the Lamborghini Miura. The Zero measured only 84 centimeters from the road to its highest point, lower by nearly 10 centimeters than the Pininfarina Ferrari Modulo of the same year. To enter it, the occupant raised the entire windscreen like a canopy, climbed over the bonnet, and lowered themselves into a reclined seat. It was powered by a 1.6-liter Lancia Fulvia engine mounted in a rear central position. It had virtually nothing in common with any production car that existed or was planned. Nuccio Bertone, the head of the coach-building firm, had not informed Lancia that he was building it. The car had been designed on an unsolicited basis because Bertone wanted the prestigious Lancia coach-building contract, which at that time went to Pininfarina. When the Zero was completed, Bertone drove it personally to the Lancia factory gates. To demonstrate how low the car was, he drove it under the barrier at the entrance at normal speed, clearing it comfortably while the Lancia workers gathered to watch. He later recalled the applause from the crowd of factory employees and described the moment as unforgettable. In the crowd that day was Cesare Fiorio, the head of Lancia's competition department, HF Course, which he had co-founded in 1965 and built into one of the most capable rally operations in Italy. Fiorio was living with a problem that had been growing for 2 years. The Lancia Fulvia, which had been winning national and international rally championships since the mid-1960s, was reaching the end of its competitive life. Mid-engined cars from Renault and Ford were beginning to demonstrate that the front-engined, front-wheel drive Fulvia formula could no longer dominate at the highest level. Fiorio needed a replacement, urgently, and the replacement needed to be mid-engined, purpose-built, and uncompromised. When Fiorio saw the zero pass under that factory barrier, he reportedly said to Nuccio Bertone that he could see in it the future rally car Lancia needed. By early 1971, Bertone had been commissioned to develop the concept into a practical racing prototype, and the next stage of one of the most extraordinary engineering projects in the history of motorsport was underway. Section 2, the engineering of an obsession, building the Stratos HF. The Lancia Stratos HF prototype, a more practical evolution of the Zero concept, was presented at the Turin Motor Show in November 1971. The production version retained the striking wedge shape, but now had conventional doors, a crescent-shaped wraparound windscreen with a constant geometric radius specifically chosen to minimize distortion at speed, and a cockpit designed around the physical measurements of Sandro Munari, Lancia's primary factory rally driver, who stood 1 meter and 76 centimeters tall. Everything inside the car was built to his dimensions. The 2 door pockets were specifically sized and shaped to hold the driver's and co-driver's crash helmets. The engine that the production Stratos used was the Ferrari Dyno 2.4-liter V6, and obtaining that engine involved one of the most diplomatically sensitive negotiations in Italian motorsport history. Lancia needed 500 units for homologation. Ferrari's road car division, the Dino, was being phased out. But Enzo Ferrari's engineers were not enthusiastic about supplying their engine to a competitor, even one from within the broader Fiat orbit. Fiat, having acquired a major stake in Ferrari in 1969. The same year, it had rescued the loss-making Lancia. Negotiations dragged through most of 1972, with Lancia at various points making contingency plans involving Maserati and Lancia's own twin-cam 4-cylinder unit. It was only when Lancia's managing director Pier Ugo Gobato, working with Enzo Ferrari directly, presented Fiat management with the fait accompli of a completed deal that Fiat finally consented. In December 1972, 500 Dino V6 engines were approved for delivery to Lancia. The engineering team assembled for the project was exceptional by any measure. Gianpaolo Dallara, the chassis designer responsible for the Lamborghini Miura, and later the De Tomaso Pantera, took responsibility for the mid-engine layout and transmission integration. Nicola Materazzi, who would later design the Ferrari 288 GTO, handled the chassis and suspension calculations. Mike Parks, the British racing driver and engineer who had raced for Ferrari and Formula One in the 1960s, was responsible for testing and development. Cesare Fiorio provided the sporting direction that unified the entire project. The chassis was a steel monocoque central cell, extended by front spars to carry the suspension, and a tubular rear cradle to house the engine and 5-speed gearbox. The body panels, front clamshell, rear clamshell including both rear wings, and doors were all fiberglass and polyester resin, chosen for weight reduction. The complete front clip hinged forward over the spare wheel, giving mechanics immediate access to the front suspension. The rear clamshell hinged back to expose the engine, gearbox, and fuel tank. In competition, both panels could be removed in seconds. The car weighed below 900 kilograms, in road specification. In the Stradale road version, the Ferrari 5.6 produced 190 brake horsepower at 7,000 revolutions per minute. The competition versions, developed progressively through the 1970s, moved from the 12-valve configuration producing approximately 240 horsepower to 24-valve versions producing up to 300 horsepower, and eventually to fuel-injected variants reaching 330 brake horsepower. The turbocharged Group 5 versions, built for closed-circuit endurance racing, produced approximately 380 brake horsepower from 2.4 liters. The road car was startling to drive and genuinely challenging for anyone who had not prepared themselves for what it was. Classic and sports car described the V6 as giving a low-rev growl turning into a bark as it zips through its range as intoxicating as anything that has ever resonated through a forest stage. The Stratos. was, the magazine noted, a purpose-built rally car and makes no concessions to comfort or ease of driving, 0 to 60 miles per hour in under 7 seconds. A top speed of approximately 143 miles per hour. And handling that rewarded precision and punished complacency in equal measure. Section 3. The rally record that should have been enough. The competition history of the Lancia Stratos is, by any rational assessment, one of the most remarkable in the sport's history. The car won its first rally in April 1973, the Firestone Rally in Spain, with Sandro Munari driving before it had even been officially homologated for Group 4 competition. It competed through the 1973 season in the Group 5 prototype class, accumulating wins in the Tour de l'Aise, the Tour de France Automobile, and several European Championship events. The homologation ceremony took place on the 1st of October 1974, when FIA delegates arrived to count the required road cars at various locations across Italy. The 1974 World Rally Championship was itself a truncated affair. The global oil crisis of October 1973 had forced a reduction from 13 rounds to 8, all concentrated in the second half of the year. Lancia won 3 of those rounds, including the San Remo, the Rideau Lakes in Canada, and the Tour de Corse, and accumulated enough points for the Constructors' Championship title. In 1975 and again in 1976, the Stratos won the World Rally Championship outright, with Sandro Munari and Björn Waldegård dividing the driving duties between them. Monte Carlo victories in 1975, 1976, and 1977, all driven by Munari, established the car's particular reputation on the demanding, mixed-surface Swiss and French stages that made up that event. In the European Rally Championship, the Stratos accumulated 50 victories and won the championship 3 times between 1976 and 1978. The car was winning races with private teams as late as 1981. The last of its 18 World Rally Championship victories came on the 1981 Tour de Corse, driven for the French Chardonnay team by Bernard Darniche. This was 5 years after Lancia had withdrawn factory support from the program. What made the Stratos so dominant? Several things. The short wheelbase, just 2,180 millimeters, gave it a rotational agility that larger, heavier cars could not match on tight stage roads. The mid-engine layout, genuinely a first for a purpose-built rally car at this level of competition, provided handling balance that front-engined machines could not replicate on the varied surfaces a World Rally Championship season demanded. And the V6's torque delivery, flexible, progressive, robust, gave drivers the confidence to use full power out of slow corners in conditions where an all-or-nothing power delivery would have defeated them. Section 4. Why Lancia killed it at the peak. And then, at the end of the 1976 season, Lancia withdrew the Stratos from official factory competition. The car that had just won 3 consecutive World Rally Championships, that had never been beaten on the Monte Carlo, that private teams were continuing to win with across Europe and beyond, was sidelined. Not because it was slow, not because it was unreliable, because Fiat wanted its own car to win instead. The sequence of events that led to this decision runs as follows. By 1975, the Fiat Group, which owned both Lancia and Abarth, had decided that the promotional value of rally success needed to be concentrated on a car that bore a Fiat badge rather than a Lancia badge. The commercial logic was straightforward. If you were going to spend the money and personnel required to run a World Rally Championship program, it was more commercially efficient to do it with a car that bore the name of a mass-market product people could walk into a showroom and buy. The Fiat 131 Abarth was the chosen vehicle. Rally responsibility was formally transferred from Lancia to the Fiat racing program, managed out of the Abarth factory. The practical consequence was that factory Stratos development and factory team entry ceased at the end of 1976. The car had by then accumulated 3 consecutive world titles and was, in the opinion of those closest to the program, capable of several more. Cesare Fiorio, the man who had conceived the entire project, shepherded it from Nuccio Bertone's unsolicited concept through to world championship dominance, found himself watching the car he had built being parked while a production saloon was sent out in its place. Private teams, naturally, continued to campaign their Stratos cars without factory support and continued to win with them. The official Fiat 131 program was competitive and eventually successful. It won the World Rally Championship in 1977 and 1978. But the manner of the Stratos' retirement sits uncomfortably with any assessment of the car on its merits. It was not retired because it was beaten. It was retired because it was considered inconvenient. The road car situation was, if anything, more difficult. Approximately 492 Stradales had been built across the production run, assembled partly at Bertone's Grugliasco plant and partly at the Lancia Chivasso factory and the service course workshop in Via Caraglio, Turin. The records are incomplete, characteristically Italian, characteristically frustrating for historians. In Italy, the road car had been offered at roughly the same price as the Ferrari Dino, which reflected its specification and performance, but placed it well beyond the reach of most buyers. Italian tax changes during the mid-1970s made the car even less commercially attractive. The oil crisis discouraged the purchase of high-performance road cars across all of Europe. And in many countries, the Stratos was not homologated for street registration at all, which effectively made it unsaleable to private buyers outside the motorsport community. The last factory new Stratos was sold in 1978. By that time, the car had accumulated its World Championship victories, its European Championship titles, its Monte Carlo hat-trick, and its reputation as the single most focused, purpose-built rally car the sport had ever seen. Section 5. What remained and what it is worth now. The approximately 492 Stradales that survive production are, today, among the most desirable and significant motorsport road cars in the world. Auction results from the major houses tell the story clearly. In 2013, a 1974 Stradale, described as one of only 492 examples, built and carefully preserved by one Swiss owner for 35 years, sold at Gooding & Company's Pebble Beach auction for $429,000. A 1977 single-owner example, with under 39,000 kilometers on the odometer, sold at RM Auctions in Paris in 2015 for €386,400. The range for a good, original, numbers-matching example at recent auction has typically been between €350,000 and €500,000, depending on history, specification, and provenance. These are not cars that have found their values by accident. The Stratos has always been understood, by the Italian collector community and beyond, as something qualitatively different from the typical production sports car of its era. It is, as the classic driver market notes, historically significant as the first car from a major manufacturer conceived specifically for rallying, a description that is simultaneously accurate and somehow inadequate to what the car actually was. The Stratos Zero concept, which began the entire sequence of events, was sold at auction in Italy in 2011 for €761,600. It is currently owned by Philip Serafim. It has been displayed at the Peterson Automotive Museum in Los Angeles, the High Museum of Art in Atlanta, the Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance in 2024, where it won its class and was nominated for Best in Show, and more recently at various exhibitions in Europe. It is 84 centimeters high and cannot be entered without raising the windscreen. The car's cultural legacy extends in multiple directions. The Stratos effectively created the category of homologation special, the thinly disguised race car built in minimum numbers purely to satisfy a regulatory requirement, with the road version existing as a commercial afterthought. The Group B cars of the 1980s, the Lancia Delta S4, the Peugeot 205 T16, the Audi Sport Quattro, are all direct descendants of the philosophy the Stratos established. It was the first car to demonstrate that you could win a World Rally Championship with a machine designed from the blank sheet for that specific purpose, without compromise. without consideration for passenger comfort, or fuel economy, or insurance ratings, or anything else that normal automotive development requires. The Lancia Stratos was killed at the peak of its powers because the company that owned it decided that winning with the wrong badge was less commercially useful than winning with the right one. That is a rational decision that can be defended on marketing grounds. It is also, in the context of what the Stratos was and what it had achieved, almost incomprehensible. The car was conceived because a coach builder drove an impossibly low wedge-shaped study under a factory barrier and made a crowd of workers applaud. It was built because a competition manager looked at that study and understood immediately that it was the shape of the future. It was powered by an engine that Enzo Ferrari agreed to supply, partly because Lancia threatened to use a Maserati unit instead. It was tested and developed by men who between them had designed the Lamborghini Miura, the Ferrari 288 GTO, and raced in Formula One for Ferrari. It won 3 consecutive World Rally Championships with a field of 492 road cars as its technical qualification for entry. And then, it was told, politely but firmly, to stop winning because a production saloon needed the publicity more. The private teams carried on winning for 5 more years. The car went on outlasting its official retirement as comprehensively as it had outlasted every rival it encountered on a special stage. There are cars in automotive history that were extraordinary and became famous. The Lancia Stratos was extraordinary and was then deliberately obscured because its success was inconvenient for a parent company's marketing strategy. That is perhaps the most Italian possible ending for a car that was also, without any qualification, the most Italian possible creation. Now we want to hear from you. Have you ever sat in a Stratos or seen one competing? Do you remember the Monte Carlo victories, Munari in the fog and the ice, the Stratos somehow finding grip where nothing else could? Perhaps you have a view on whether the decision to replace it with the Fiat 131 was justified, or whether it was simply commercial politics overriding sporting integrity. Tell us in the comments below. If this video has been worth your time, please give it a like. It helps us reach the audience that shares this passion for the cars that changed motorsport history. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do that now. There are many more stories ahead. Thank you, truly, for watching.